Good afternoon. Good afternoon. I'm Jim Pellegrino, and I'm Vice President of the National Academy of Education. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the annual meeting and to this first plenary session we have scheduled for today. This is the first of 3 plenary sessions that we have planned for the members' meeting, and we're very excited about each of the panels. And I'm not going to take any of their time other than to introduce our panelists. This first panel is on a topic that I think many of us have deep concerns about, which has to do with U.S. higher education, diversity and democracy in a global context. And we are thrilled to have Mike McPherson as the chair of this panel, and 3 outstanding panelists: Sandy Astin from the University of California at Los Angeles, Jim Banks from the University of Washington, and Julie Posselt from USC. So I'm going to turn it over to Mike, and who is going to manage the afternoon session and get off the stage.
Thank you, Jim, and thanks to all. I'm told there is an audience out there, but the lights are such that there's not a lot of evidence of it. But we're very glad to be part of this occasion for the National Academy, and thank you all for joining us. We have a wonderful panel, and we settled on a rather generous territory to operate in: diversity and democracy, and putting that in a global context. So if we can't find something to say in there, we're all in trouble. We're going to have about 15 minutes of remarks from each of our 3 panelists, and then we will have, after that, about a half hour for engagement across the panel and with the audience. And we're going to actually go, as it turns out, in alphabetical order. Let me say just a word or 2 of introduction to these very well-known people, and then we'll just turn to them in order. So Sandy Astin, of course, is one of the deans, I guess one could say, of higher education research. He and his late wife, Lena, created the Higher Education Research Institute at UCLA, produced some of the most important and lasting databases in higher education work, and probably got more inside the heads and hearts of undergraduates and other students than perhaps any other researchers who've worked in this arena. We're extremely fortunate to have him with us. Jim Banks, very distinguished professor from the University of Washington, former president of the American Education Research Association, and has accumulated about every other honor one could find. He has been a leading researcher on diversity in education and on ethnic education over a great many years, and all of us have had great opportunities to learn from him. He is also, in the very best sense of the word, a true gentleman, extremely gracious man. Our third panelist isn't distinguished. You haven't been around long enough to be distinguished, but the forecasts are extremely positive. Julie has a PhD from the University of Michigan. She is an assistant professor in higher education at the University of Southern California. She is also, speaking of good forecasting evidence, she is an NAED Spencer postdoctoral fellow. And we're very proud to have you with that role among us. So each of our speakers has some remarks prepared, and we're going to begin with Sandy.
Thanks, Mike. I just realized we have a Pac-12 panel here.
You're also all from blue states, if I may.
That's right. Yeah, hooray for the blue states. The inequities in our K-12 education system are well known, and particularly with this rapidly expanding system of private schools and the striking contrast between the urban and the suburban public schools. Our higher education system, on the other hand, is generally regarded, particularly by people globally, as a far more equitable system, given that each of the 50 states attempts to provide low-cost higher education opportunities for almost any high school graduate. Nevertheless, these open access state systems mask an important truth about American post-secondary education. The opportunities available to students with differing levels of academic preparation are far from equivalent. Our system invests the most in those students with the highest levels of academic preparation and the least in those with the poorest preparation. As long as post-secondary educational opportunities remain so unequal for students with differing levels of preparation, little can be done in higher education to achieve a more just and equitable society. The unequal educational treatment of college students stems largely from the fact that American higher education is designed to favor our smartest students, that relatively small number who get the top grades in school and the highest scores on admissions tests. The most prestigious colleges limit their admissions to such students and a few jocks, which means that all the other students must attend colleges with fewer resources and staffed by faculty members who, according to national surveys, would rather be teaching smarter students. Every fall, faculty members watch closely to see how well their new freshmen have scored on admissions tests. The smarter the students, as reflected in their average scores, the better. And once students enroll, most professors rely on course grades to assess student progress. Grades may be useful in identifying the smartest students, which is why we give them, but don't tell much about what students are learning. Given that learning is the main business of any college or university, this lack of information on what's being learned is regrettable, since it deprives students and college teachers of valuable feedback that could strengthen the academic learning process among students at all levels of preparation. In short, faculty seem content with assessment methods that are of little use in measuring what students are learning, as long as these methods allow them to rank students in terms of their relative smartness. When SATs and ACTs are used to screen and select, they put poor students, first-generation students, and underrepresented students of color at a competitive disadvantage. If colleges were equivalent in the opportunities they provided, this wouldn't be a problem, but they're far from equivalent. In public higher education, which educates 80% of all students, the four-year colleges spend more than twice as much per full-time undergraduate student on instruction as the community colleges do. Also, whereas most of the full-time freshmen enrolling at four-year public colleges live on the campus, an experience that's been shown in many, many research studies to enhance the learning process, most community colleges have no residential facilities. In effect, our colleges and universities and the academics who run them have become obsessed with what I like to call smartness. This preoccupation with being smart has affected almost everything we do in academe, to the point where it's compromised our most basic missions of educating our students and serving the society that supports us. Let me point out just a few things about higher education that this preoccupation with smartness has affected. First, there's standardized testing. We test because we want to identify the smartest students. And we go along with the testing company's long-standing practice of normative scoring. Note that standard scores and percentiles don't reveal much of anything about what a student knows. Instead, they merely order them from the smartest to the least smart. But then that's mainly what the institutions are after, to identify the smartest students. Schools at the K-12 level have come to rely heavily on standardized tests, in part because we at the collegiate level are such heavy users. Since the smartest students account for only a small minority of those who are tested, the truly insidious aspect of normative testing at the K-12 level is that it sends powerful negative messages to the average and underprepared students. You're not college material. You're dumb. You're lazy. You're a loser. Since most school students receive such messages year after year, it's no wonder that so many young people lose interest in education before they ever reach college age. Another serious limitation of these tests is their narrowness of content. If you consult college mission statements to find out what student outcomes are most valued by institutions, and this is based on several systematic studies of college mission statements, you're most likely to find qualities like leadership skills, social responsibility, creativity, and citizenship, none of which have much relevance to what standardized tests measure. In other words, to equate student smartness with standardized test scores like the SAT or the ACT greatly oversimplifies the remarkable diversity of human talent. Another practice that reflects our obsession with smartness is selective admissions. We faculty admit only the smartest students because it reflects well on us. If our students are so smart, surely we must be pretty smart. I'm sorry, folks. This heavy reliance on SATs and ACTs has helped to spawn an annual, what I call admissions madness, where affluent students and their parents break their necks to gain admission to the most selective institution they can manage. Institutional competition for smart students is intimately tied in to the infamous pecking order of colleges and universities that U.S. News attempts to document every year in what has proved to be its most profitable enterprise. There are now about 24 imitations of that rating and ranking that go on because there's a big market for it. We faculty prefer to work in the highest ranked institutions, in part because it feeds our egos. The more selective and exclusive and elite our institution, the better. Some of our less elite universities have actually resorted to purchasing smart students with national merit scholarships just to elevate their prestige and enhance their U.S. News rankings. Virtually none of our most elite colleges engage in this practice, however, since they can get their very smart students for free. As a matter of fact, the Big 12 athletic conference, which is known primarily for its formidable football teams, enrolls more merit scholars than the Ivy League. But something like 80% of their merit scholars are sponsored, whereas not a single one of the Ivy League's merit scholars is sponsored. Our obsession with smartness also helps perpetuate the dubious practice of grading. If faculty members really wanted to assess the effectiveness of their pedagogy and document what students are actually learning, they could hardly pick a worse assessment method than course grades. So why do so many institutions persist in giving course grades? Because they can be useful in differentiating the smartest students from all the rest. And why do we want to do this? Well, for honors programs, for graduation with honors, and at the bottom end of the ranking for academic probation or dismissal. Graduate and professional schools and employers like grades, of course, for the same reason, but grades tell us virtually nothing about student learning. Still, another function that's heavily influenced by our obsession with smartness is research, and especially the age-old tension between research and teaching. American higher education has struggled for decades with the problem of research versus teaching. This conflict is especially severe in the major research universities, but the publish or perish mandate affects faculty in many smaller universities and liberal arts colleges as well. Once again, it's the faculty's preoccupation with smartness that fuels this imbalance. Most faculty value research because they believe that writing and publishing requires a good deal of intelligence and smartness. There's little agreement, however, on what it takes to be a good classroom teacher and advisor. Moreover, whereas there's a clearly established performance standard for demonstrating your smartness through research and scholarship, and that's publication, there's no agreed upon way to know for sure how good a colleague is at teaching and advising. The relative importance assigned to research versus teaching is revealed in the terminology that we use. Practically all faculty members at one time or another have probably made reference to their teaching load. And when a university is trying to recruit a new faculty member, one of the perks that's sometimes offered is a reduced teaching load. Such language implies that for at least some faculty members, teaching is regarded as a burden. By contrast, one never hears university faculty members refer to their research load. Here, in a nutshell, is the crux of the research versus teaching dilemma. College professors attach great importance to research and scholarship because they have created a culture that venerates smartness, but they happen to be employed in institutions where their main responsibility is to educate students. This reverence for smartness influences how faculty view different disciplines. Why do the hard sciences have so much status and prestige on university campuses? And why are fields like nursing, social work, and education often looked down upon? Because professors in the hard sciences are regarded as the smartest, whereas professors, I'm sorry to say, in nursing, social work, and education are suspected of being not so smart. Perhaps the most telling evidence of how academics' obsession with smartness affects their relations with students comes from national surveys, and this is really depressing. Fully half of all college faculty report that they are not satisfied with the quality of their students. And more than half report that working with underprepared students is a source of stress. Clearly, in a culture that venerates smartness, working with the less than the smart students is not a valued activity. I'd like to wrap this formal part of the presentation up with a final observation about educational equity and diversity. Higher education's obsession with smartness causes it to favor its best prepared students and to treat its other students, especially its average and least well-prepared ones, as second-class citizens. Since average and underprepared students include disproportionate numbers of poor students, first-generation students, and underrepresented students of color, such unequal treatment tends to exacerbate inequalities of wealth, power, and race that have already reached unacceptable levels in the United States. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandy. I just wish sometime you would just tell us what you really think. Let me turn to Jim.
Thank you very much. My presentation is called Civic Education in the Age of Global Migration. And I think the connection with Sandy's talk is that I'll be talking about the need to educate for diversity and citizenship education. And I think I myself went to one of those two-year colleges, as do many, and I was a first-generation student, and I think many first-generation students go to two-year colleges. So that's why I got my start at Chicago City Colleges in Chicago, then to Chicago Teachers College. I want to talk about this project and acknowledge that it is based upon a book that two of my colleagues and I just completed for the National Academy of Education It's called Global Migration, Diversity, and Civic Education, Improving Policy and Practice. And I want to acknowledge my co-editor, Marcelo, could you raise your hand? Suarez Orozco is here, and several of the contributors. Sonia Nieto contributed it. Sonia, are you here? And Carola Suarez Orozco. I wanted to acknowledge those colleagues. I also want to acknowledge Michael McPherson from the Spencer Foundation for funding this project. And so my talk is really based on my chapter in this book, and you can get a flyer on this book. You probably got it when you registered. If you didn't, please go get it before you leave. And ask your library to order it, because for every copy sold, the National Academy gets the royalties. So this was our contribution to the National Academy. Okay, let me go on then. I will simply not talk about the book, because you can see the chapters on the flyer that you can pick up at the registration desk. I'll talk about my chapter in the book. First, I wanted to show you some statistics. I don't know how well you can you see those back where you are? I wanted to give you some idea.
Can you see through us? Okay.
I wanted to share some statistics of ethnic minorities in American universities, and this is from the National Center for Education Statistics. And as you can see, from 2000 to 2014, the white percentage of the population in American colleges and universities is steadily decreasing, and the people of color are steadily increasing. Can you see that? And so that currently we have, for the white population, about 58.3, and the people of color, about 41.7%. And by the way, this is also happening in our public schools. We look at the public schools in 2014, or is it 2015? One of these 2014-15 school year is the exact, what I mean, is the first year where this population of students of color in the public school exceeded the whites. And that will continue. And Marcelo's chapter in the book does a beautiful job of talking about these projections. In the next slide, I'd like to show in addition to having students of color domestically, we also have a large number of students who are international. And sometimes these get conflated on campuses in terms of professors and students' perceptions. But at the University of Washington, we're about 1/3 students of color at the university, undergraduates, University of Washington. But we also have a substantial percentage of international students. And as you can see, our largest number nationally, not at the University of Washington, although I suspect this would reflect the University of Washington. The largest percentage number is from China. The next largest number is from India, then South Korea, and I don't have to read this out, you can see it. I thought you'd find it interesting to see just what countries these students represent. Okay, my chapter in our book describes how global migration is challenging national conceptions of citizenship and citizenship education, and how selected nations are reconceptualizing citizenship and citizenship education to respond to global migration and to attain cultural sustainability and social cohesion. In other words, global migration is forcing nation states to think about citizenship and citizenship education, and it's forcing them to rethink and reconceptualize notions such as sustainability and social cohesion. What is social cohesion in a diverse society, and how do you attain it? And you can't attain it simply by, as we've done historically, forced assimilation. And so that we really have to negotiate national boundaries, which are becoming more porous in a nation of in a world of globalization. So here, my chapter also examines the educational problems and promises caused by the diversity that is a consequence of global migration, and it reviews theory and research that provide guidelines for helping students to acquire the knowledge, skills, and values required to become effective citizens of their communities, nation, and the world in the age of global migration. And again, Marcelo, in his opening chapter, does a beautiful job of giving a conceptual survey of globalization and its impact on education. When they are marginalized within schools and treated as the other, ethnic minority students, such as Turkish students in Germany and Muslim students in England and China, and of course I could add African Americans and Latinos in the United States, when they are marginalized within the school, they tend to emphasize their ethnic identity and to have weaker attachments to their nation state than mainstream and structurally included students. So that the implication of this is for education and citizenship is that students need to feel a sense of inclusion, a sense of belonging, if they are to develop strong national identities. So that's really, really significant, and I explore that quite a bit in this chapter. In order to develop a society that is culturally sustainable and that has social cohesion that results from structural inclusion and not from a policy of forced assimilation and what Joel Springs called deculturalization, marginalized ethnic, cultural, linguistic, and religious groups must experience in what Amy Gutman's called cultural recognition and civic equality within schools, colleges, and universities, and within society writ large. And Amy talks about cultural recognition and civic equality in her book, Democratic Education, which is a classic in our field. The extent to which nation states make multicultural citizenship possible, the achievement gap between minority and majority students, and the language rights of immigrant and minority students are among the unresolved and contentious issues related to citizenship education, cultural sustainability, and social cohesion with which diverse nations and schools must deal in this age of globalization and migration. So nation states deal with this notion of respond to migration in very different ways. The classic immigration nations, such as Australia, Canada, and the United States, try in principle to implement multicultural citizenship, but they create what I call in this chapter the citizenship education dilemma. Even though in the United States social studies classes, we talk about democratic ideals, and of course Murdoch described those ideals in 1944 in his classic book called The American Dilemma. We preach these things, but we have students experiencing inequality within schools and within classrooms, and as Sandy pointed out, within universities. So students learn about democracy, and then they experience stratification. So I call that the citizenship education dilemma. But we immigrant nations are in principle committed to multicultural citizenship. On the other hand, nations such as Germany and Japan have looked at citizenship not in terms of ideals as we do in Canada and the US, but rather historically, citizenship in nations such as Japan and Germany has been who has German blood or who has Japanese blood. Now that's changing tremendously, but that was the historic conception of citizenship. In the United States, you became a citizen by endorsing a set of ideals, but historically in Germany and Japan, and Korea, I might add, it was by blood. In France, the goal is assimilation and inclusion, but giving up, if you're a Muslim, giving up the hijab, which has been banned in schools, or the veil, and so forth. And France is now prohibiting the wearing of the burqa in public spaces. So France really means seriously that you can become a French citizen, but it's giving up much of your culture. And of course, the big problem issue is China is not immigrants from other nations, but internal migration. If you're coming from another city to Beijing, you don't become a citizen by that movement. Okay, I'm recommending in this chapter what I'm calling effective citizenship education. And what I'm calling this transformative citizenship education. And it helps students to acquire academic knowledge and skills required to become literate and reflective citizens. It helps students attain the knowledge, values, and skills needed to participate in their cultural, national, regional, and world communities. Just thinking of our recent election, when only, about 50% of the people voted, and one candidate got about 25% of the popular vote, and another candidate got 26% of the vote. Just think of a modern nation state where only about half of the people vote. And what does that mean? And then what does citizenship education mean in a modernized nation state where only half the citizens vote, and the division between the two candidates was about 25 and 26%. I'm quoting you, Pat, so I hope you were accurate. Pat gave me those figures yesterday, Pat Graham. And if Pat Graham told me, it had to be true. So that my point is the students need knowledge. They need to understand if they don't vote, it has consequences, and they need to know the consequences of their voting. So they also need the knowledge, values, and skills needed to participate within and across communities and within the national civic culture. They also need democratic racial attitudes and values. Okay, I should be doing okay. I'm trying to time myself. So that some studies, so what I'm advocating is kind of not only to help students of color and diverse students get a sense of inclusion, I'm suggesting we need to implement cultural responsive pedagogy, such as that developed by my colleague Geneva Gay and Gloria Ladson-Billings. Some studies provide empirical support for the premise that when teachers use culturally responsive pedagogy, the academic achievement of minority students increases. Culturally responsive pedagogy reflects the cultural difference paradigm and rejects the notion, the cultural deficit conception that I don't really have time to go into. Helping students, so what do we need to do to create effective, what I'm calling transformative citizenship education? Thank you. We need to help students to acquire democratic attitudes and values. So the research on curriculum materials, these are some things we need to do to implement transformative citizenship education. We need to implement learning conditions within the classroom that are characterized by what Gordon Allport indicates are the conditions for intergroup contact. And they are creating equal status, creating common goals, creating cooperation, and creating support of authorities. In other words, you can't just bring African Americans and whites together, or Latinos and whites together, according to Allport, and expect them to get along effectively. We have to create conditions for that to take place. And also, we need to create curricular interventions, cooperative learning and interracial contact, and we need to create cross-cutting superordinate groups, which I don't have time to really go into. But I would like to state that studies by a number of researchers indicate that the cultural and national identities of immigrant youth are contextual, evolving, and culturally reconstructed. When I'm in Seattle, my first identity is a black male, but when I get to London, my first identity is what? American. I'm very critical of America in Seattle, but very defensive of it in London. So that identity is fluid. There's the fluidity of identity, and it's contextual. And I think that this is what we need to understand. Okay, I'm getting close to concluding. mainstream citizen, so I'm arguing in the paper that in mainstream citizenship education, which you see throughout the world, you see it in England, you see it in China, that in mainstream citizenship education is grounded in mainstream knowledge and assumptions. It reinforces the status quo and the dominant power relationships in society, and it does not challenge or disrupt the class, racial, and gender discrimination within schools and society. I'm advocating a transformative citizenship education that is rooted in transformative academic knowledge. It enables students to acquire the knowledge, skills, and values needed to challenge inequality within their communities, their nations, in the world, and to take action to create just and democratic multicultural communities. And one of the actions is to vote. I grew up in a small Black community in the South where my parents were farmers. And the one day when they put down the farming tools and went to town, which is a 9 miles drive, and in the wagon initially, eventually we got a truck. But my parents stopped everything to go to town to vote. So this is the legacy I think young people need to understand of how hard we fought to get the right to vote and how my parents really struggled and made sure they voted in every election. I'm going to skip some of this, and I'm going to make two other points, and then I'll stop. What I'm arguing is that the transformative curriculum helps students to develop effective cultural identifications, effective national identification, global identifications, and particularly in places like Europe, a regional identification. And these identifications are fluid, contextual, and that historically what we've done in schools is eradicated kids' cultural and language identification, trying to make them fit into some conceptual national identity. And of course, as we teach these identities in a transformative curriculum, we also teach students to know, to care, and to act, and that these three concepts intersect. I'm going to end with a quote from my favorite writer, James Baldwin, because I think what he says about citizenship encapsulates what I'm trying to say about transformative citizenship. In an extemporaneous speech to a group of teachers in New York City in 1983, James Baldwin described the kinds of thoughtful citizens we need to educate and the dark consequences of not doing so. And by the way, you can Google this speech, which I use with my students. It's one of his wonderful speeches. It's called A Talk to Teachers, and you can Google it and find it online. Baldwin says in this powerful essay, the purpose of education is to create in a person the ability to look at the world for himself, to make his own decisions, to say to himself that this is black or this is white, to decide for himself whether there's a God in heaven or not, to ask questions of the universe and then to live with those questions is the way he achieves his identity. But no society is really anxious to have that kind of person around. What society really ideally wants is a citizenry that will simply obey the rules of society. If a society succeeds in this, that society is about to perish. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. And Julie.
Good afternoon. So higher education in the residential forms that we recognize today appears to have started about the 5th century BC in India, Pakistan, and Greece. And the American higher education model that we have today largely derives from the Greek one. Institutions like Plato's Academy and Aristotle's Lyceum were intellectual hubs that drew young men from throughout the Greek world, but especially the wealthy elites who were male of Athens, to receive training for leadership at a substantial fee. Their founders believed that democracies demanded differentiated training. that we needed to have warriors and auxiliaries trained to be peacekeepers, that we needed producers who were trained in vocational activities, and then, of course, that there would be philosopher kings and guardians who had the opportunity to study the arts and sciences. So the perceived need for a certain sort of character among leaders justified the selection of elites for this last track. And what we see today is that from the beginning, higher education has stratified democracies in the interest of serving democracies. And like today, it disproportionately provides paths to leadership for wealthy white men. My research uses organizational and sociocultural theory to examine stratification in graduate education and selective colleges and universities. I focus on access to and well-being in these sectors of higher education and how faculty are negotiating long-standing norms like merit in light of status pressures, financial pressures on the one hand, and our country's changing demographics on the other. Like Sandy, I find that the structure of access is very much disproportionately geared to high-achieving students. In selective colleges and in graduate programs, we much more often than not provide opportunities to students who are already on track to take leadership roles in society. Patterns like this have led some scholars to compare colleges to finishing schools and to compare graduate programs to little more than engines of inequality. So this begs the question, why do institutions do this? An obsession with smartness is definitely part of it. I've also been looking at this from a slightly different angle, from the organizational actors angle. Specifically, two of my projects have tried to understand things from their perspective with an understanding that their way of seeing things become our starting points for dialogue. So I found that resource dependency theory is a useful framework here. It argues that organizational behavior typically responds to whatever the current socio-political environment and its demands are. Universities are famously loath to change, but survival instincts will compel them, in many cases, to whatever the expectations of powerful resource providers may be. Under the threat that resources like wealth, money, status will be lost or withdrawn, institutions have been shown time and again to pivot very quickly and adopt practices that they might otherwise have avoided. So we saw this in the 1960s in the wake of student protests, when suddenly responses to this were a form of crisis management, and affirmative action was picked up by many institutions. And in the decades that followed, institutional compliance with various federal policies around equal opportunity and Title IX also reflected this trend. More recently, we've seen it take place in clinical psychology PhD programs, which scrambled to implement practices that encourage diversity when the American Psychological Association changed their accreditation standards to require that. So my empirical research on contemporary higher education shows this combination of incremental adaptation to a diversifying population, but also a lot of action that subsumes those interests to financial ones and to the sort of siren song of money and status. Some would say it's really just rational behavior. Status pressures that are created by our definitely rankings-obsessed society, as Sandy talked about, they put public research universities in particular in a really tough spot. They make it much more difficult to privilege the historic mission of access on which they were founded, and make it more logical for them to attract students who can help replace the lost tuition that would have been provided from the state. So the combination of access, status, and finances constitute what's been called an iron triangle of enrollment management. In one recent study, we found through institutional level panel analysis that increasing out-of-state enrollment can help public flagship universities simultaneously promote academic selectivity because out-of-state students have higher grades and higher test scores, and it can help them replace lost appropriations by generating tuition revenue. There's often no tuition caps for out-of-state students the way that there are for in-state students. But this comes with very clear trade-offs for the access side of the triangle. We found that as the share of non-resident students increased in public flagships, that the percentage of Pell Grant recipients and underrepresented minority students declined. So you can imagine that if the student body is pizza, that the amount of pie growing for out-of-state students resulted in a declining amount of pizza for everybody else. We found that these relationships were strongest in states that have large minoritized populations and in states that have affirmative action bans. Now, at the graduate level, my ethnographic research on admissions to highly ranked PhD programs comes to some similar conclusions from a very different sort of set of data. This project was trying to unpack faculty conceptions of merit and why faculty tend to lean so much on indicators of merit, especially GRE scores and having attended a selective college, that undermine their goals of equity and diversity. Now, I found several explanations of why they do this, which you can go buy my book to find out. But one of them was the pressure to remain really strong with respect to test scores and grades for the sake of protecting or raising their ranking. In a chapter of the book on international students, I describe how this group occupies a position that's similar to those of out-of-state students at the undergraduate level. International students have higher GRE scores on average. They much more often come with their own funding. And typically, they represent a variety of racial and ethnic backgrounds. Therefore, they can help fulfill financial interests and tuition revenue, academic selectivity, while also adding to the ethnic diversity of the student body. It would seem that this is a way out of this iron triangle, right? But in practice, I found that this is really contested. Should international students count, quote unquote, toward diversity? I would bet that we could have a very spirited conversation about that in this group. But the majority of my participants said no. With the exception of faculty in economics and physics, I found that faculty in 8 of the 10 programs thought it would be totally inappropriate for them to populate their programs with as many international students as would logically be admitted if they used only academic criteria. Rather, they felt that it was very important for them to privilege American applicants, and in particular, to attract applicants from underrepresented backgrounds in the United States. What's more, I found very clear evidence that faculty were holding views that was consistent with the model minority myth when they were evaluating applicants from China. Now, that stereotype is fundamentally one of ambivalence, and I found that it did not enhance applicants' chances. So, on average, what counts as merit in selective sectors of higher education institutionalizes inequality by favoring academically high-achieving students who are disproportionately wealthy, white, and male. The system's also riddled with idiosyncrasies that as faculty try to balance many different priorities, and themselves are subject to a variety of cognitive and social biases. Now, especially considering the recent presidential election results, I think it's clear that we need to continue studying this kind of complexity. We need to get inside of these contradictions between people's public commitments to inclusion and the decisions that they make in private and hidden places, places like admissions committees and boardrooms and even voting booths. In the new political area that we've just entered, I think we also need to be thinking really strategically about what the institutions in our society are that are positioned to continue working toward educational equity and diversity, regardless of the policy context. This is one of the reasons that foundations are so important. They can play a role of resource provision and protecting certain sort of intellectual agendas. We need universities right now to be protecting immigrant students, but we also need them to be redoubling their protections of academic freedom to ensure that those of us who study inequality have a safe platform to do so. And a concrete action that I would personally love to see from US News and World Report and the National Research Council is to rethink those algorithms that they use to calculate the rankings. I think if they were to assign some weight to the percent of Pell Grant recipients who enrolled, or the percent of Black and Latino students enrolled, that it would press institutions to move very quickly to attend to this in their recruitment and admissions work. Finally, it's incumbent on us as leading voices in US education to imagine and create systems of opportunity and support for those that the impending administration would seek to deny it. In America today, diversity and inclusion are critical to the well-being of our democracy. They're not threats, but rather intrinsic to the excellence of higher education. Granted, as we are seeing, e pluribus unum is incredibly hard work when you have a country as divided and diverse as ours. And both we and our educational institutions, I think, need to do more about how to do it better. But we're ultimately going to need education to facilitate our democracy. And unlike the ancient Greeks, that includes providing open paths to leadership for people who are from marginalized communities, both in urban and arguably in rural areas. So this takes me back to where I started my comments. The fact that most higher education scholars and administrators, including myself, know so little about early higher education forms in places like India and Pakistan, which co-occurred and even predated those in Greece, reflects this base Western-centric bias that we operate from. And I think that bias may be partly to explain why so many of our contemporary efforts to address higher education's challenges fall short. We have a relatively limited repertoire of strategies to draw from, and often they are deriving from educational models that were plagued by the same problems that we're today trying to solve. Maybe a more globally minded approach to higher learning, paired with willingness to learn from minority-serving institutions here in the United States, could provide us with imagination and wisdom to better help higher education improve opportunities for all. Thank you.
This has been an absolutely fascinating trio of presentations. One thing, I'd be interested in any responses from the panel on this. It struck me really in all three presentations, but maybe particularly in Sandy's and Julie's, that there's a certain tendency to talk about what's going on in higher education without thinking about everything that came before higher education. So if you think about smartness, there's lots and lots of evidence that there's no sense in which the people who are born to rich families are born smarter than the people who are born to poor families. The thing is that the people who are born to rich families have all kinds of opportunity to pump up their children's responsiveness to the metrics that are popular in the society. And if you change the metrics, they would just change the pumping. So it's in a sense, if you think only about higher education, you kind of have a built-in paradox, because so much is involved with undoing what the society is systematically doing before higher education. It seems to me, as somebody who tends to think pretty practically about what can be done, that there is a set of things that in principle can be done at the higher education level, and we sporadically do some of them, like developmental education, for example, or an obvious thing to do would be to address some of the inequalities between the amount of resources going to schools like community colleges. But in a longer run framework, if you actually want more equal higher education, it's hard to see how you get there in an optimal way without starting from birth. I just wonder what all of you.
I think you're exactly right. I think the kind of stratification that we see in higher ed starts very early on in early childhood.
Yeah.
That it begins there, and I think that's one of
even before birth.
or even before birth. That's a very good point. It can be because of nutrition and other kinds of factors. It can begin before birth, and that's why I think Obama's initiatives in early childhood education were so important. So I think the earlier we start intervention and to break this kind of racial and class stratification, the better. Yeah, I think it starts very early.
Sandy, Julie?
Well, the history of stratification in the public arena is very interesting. In some ways, California pioneered in this with its master plan, 1960. It's worth going back and reading that document that established the master plan, because the language is very revealing. We could have taken the approach of the University of Minnesota or the University of Illinois in the earlier days of those institutions, and hey, we're going to admit all comers, and we're going to devise ways of educating people at all levels of preparation. But instead, the California system decided, well, we don't want to bother the university with less well-prepared students, and so we'll establish community colleges, because our overall goal is to have an open system where everybody gets a shot at higher education, which is a noble goal. But in doing this, we created a stratified state system, which was imitated in practically every other state. And the language in the master plan is in, we're all hyping our publications here, but what I said today is really a very radical condensation of a book of mine that just came out called Are You Smart Enough? And in that, I dig into the master plan and pull out some of the language, and it's pretty informative. The function of the then junior colleges was to relieve the university of the burden of remediation. That's the language that was used. And so that's telling you something right away about what the higher education system thinks about less well-prepared students. And other languages is equally revealing. And I think probably the language is crafted ultimately by college faculty. And as long as we look at the education of that 80% who are not the top students as a burden and invest less in it, we're not gonna realize our potential for societal betterment. And in my mind, we can begin to take care of some of this stuff without Trump or his crowd, because higher education is going to be pretty much under the radar of these new folks in Washington anyway. So, and we have a lot of autonomy to do things differently if we choose to. And it seems to me that prioritizing the education of students at all levels of preparation and getting rid of normative testing, just getting flat rid of it, is something we have the power to do. The testing companies will scream bloody murder, but listen, we're the ones that are using these instruments, and we can take actions like that and deal with some raw scores. Raw scores at least allow you to judge, if you're willing to do some longitudinal assessment, to judge improvement over time. Using normative scoring artificially rations the amount of excellence we can have. Economists would call it creating a scarce good. There's only so many people who can be above the 90th percentile. Whereas if we deal with raw scores, we can set up absolute standards which everybody can attain or nobody. And it seems to me that that's a no-brainer. Why do we keep accepting normative scores? We ought to just send them back. Anyway.
Julie.
So I'll add to what Sandy was just saying, with some more on scores in particular, that most people don't realize that the standard error of measurement on the GRE is about 60 points. This is on the old scale at least. And so if you have a student with a 740, that's statistically equivalent to an 800. But you wouldn't know that if you visited admissions committees, where people will make a much of the difference between a 620 and a 640, or between a 770 and a 790. So I think a better understanding among the people who use scores about what their intended design and interpretation is a really important part of this conversation. Certainly, comparing students on the 90th percentile versus an 85th percentile, you think about what that would translate to in terms of raw scores and whether it's within the standard error of measurement. Certainly, that's an improper use of scores. The broader question about test scores' place in what I know best, graduate admissions, is unfortunately we're not helped out a lot by the literature on this. We could probably cover this entire stage with the research that's been done on the predictive validity of the GRE. And the two major meta-analyses of that literature came to very different conclusions. So to me, I think the conversation about test scores just it can't be the end of the conversation. It really is just one part of a much broader discussion about how we think about what we're looking for in students and how we know it when we find it.
Well, this created scarcity is not limited to students and admissions. Whenever I meet the new president of a research university, and ask them what are they trying to achieve, what's their goal, it is almost always the answer is, I want to be in the top 20. Now, I was a math major in college, and I know there are only 20 institutions in the top 20. And it was like, who are you going to bump off? So it is I don't know how deep a feature of our society is, but it's a pretty deep feature, I think. I think we should open ourselves to the audience's questions and alternative speeches. It would be a lot easier to call on people if it were possible to, I believe the phrase is, bring up the house lights. Or we'll just go ahead.
Don't you feel like doing a soft shoe dance up here?
Question over here. I'm sorry, it's really hard. The people with light-colored shirts have a big advantage here. Can you please identify yourself first?
I don't think the microphone works. I'm Todd
There
Rucker
you
from.
go.
Okay, from University of New Mexico, and a thread I heard throughout this panel and one earlier today focuses a lot on student retention, persistence to graduation. Something we've heard a lot about nowadays, and state legislatures and others are getting very interested in this topic. Something that Sandy has written about for a long time. Well, this seems like a great opportunity to improve student success. I think about what Julie said in terms of these public commitments and the decisions that are made in private venues. When I've seen work on the ground, like Sandy's about, for instance, you mentioned more on-campus housing, and this idea of this, students who graduate sooner or more likely to graduate has been used to promote policies that I think further marginalize students. They are intended to help while enriching some, like university presidents, who are increasingly receiving bonuses to promote these, increase these rates. And my institution, for instance, in a state, an institution that is majority students of color, they instituted a 15-hour kind of requirement to maintain the state lottery scholarship. They've made it cheaper to take 12 hours or 15 hours instead of 12 hours, and are trying to institute a residency requirement in a traditionally commuter university. And so I'm thinking about what can we do to impact these discussions at our institution and at larger scales to prevent research like some of the work you've presented today, and other work from creating these kind of policies that can ultimately harm our students.
Julie, do you want to
Sure.
address that?
Yeah, one of the great things that has come from doing this work on graduate admissions is realizing how many people out there are really hungry to figure out how they should be doing it. And of course, when you do ethnographic research, you have no policy prescriptions at the end of it. There is no generalizability. You offer other insights. But I think what you're getting at is something that I hear all the time from graduate school administrators, that they're looking for educational evidence that permits inferences about what works. And so I think the more that we can do to conduct research that provides that kind of inference, that's really of value. I'll always continue doing some qualitative work because that's part of how my brain works, but I do see that when administrators are confronted with evidence and that they can back it up and bring it to their superiors, that it certainly helps.
Jim, do you have thoughts in this line about what universities can do internally?
Well, it seems to me that we're very fortunate. I think leadership, I think what universities, Anna Marie Causet, who's our new president of Cuban background, a former student of Ed Gordon, I should say, at Yale. Anna Marie Causet has really taken a strong leadership position about how a state university, we're the most, of course, the state university in Washington, what our role is for equity and for citizenship and for diversity. So I think and she sent a real signal to deans that she really means it about making our university diverse and reaching across social class and lines and diversity lines. And I think it's had a real impact on our diversity of our students and our faculty. So I think leadership from the top and a strong commitment from the president is really crucial.
Does she have good support from the regents or trustees? I don't know what they're called.
Yeah, they're called regents. She is relatively new, but she has good support because they chose her in a very wide search, and they knew her because she had been provost. So, so yes, the answer is yes. And of course, we are a blue state.
That's true. Yes.
I could probably speak loud enough. I'm Natalie Melvin from George Washington University. My area is educational technology.
And your microphone is about to be in your hand.
And I was very surprised that I didn't hear anything about technology. There are many challenges in higher education, and I think technology is helping, but also standing in the way. And I'm very interested to hear if any of you have anything to say about the role of technology and the challenges in higher education. And we don't have to get into the civility stuff, but we can.
I think we have to be very careful about technology. The reason being that the folks in the capitals of the various states who wear the green eye shades are licking their chops at the prospect of being able to accommodate the growing student population with technology instead of so-called traditional undergraduate education. And it's interesting that the elite institutions that have gotten into the MOOC business and distance learning use it to augment and supplement traditional instruction. Whereas the green eye shade folks are, and they've got this rhetoric about, oh, traditional undergraduate education is a thing of the past, it's archaic, and it's inefficient, et cetera, et cetera. However, the research on student development and undergraduate education makes it very, very clear that the things that matter, or at least that we've identified that matter in undergraduate education, basically are absent in distance education. And that's student-student contact, student-faculty contact, student engagement, that sort of thing. So I get very nervous about the excitement over technology, because unless it's looked at as a way of improving or augmenting traditional instruction, I get worried that it's going to be used as a way of accommodating more students on the cheap. And guess which students are going to get the technology education if that's the way we go? The same three groups that I mentioned a couple of times in my talk.
And Jim wanted to
Yeah, and I almost took the words out of your mouth, I guess, because I'm very concerned about the class stratification of who's getting the education through technology and long distance. I noticed, for example, that the University of Phoenix, I guess isn't it the largest population, that a large number of blacks and Latinos get their education online. I've noticed, I haven't done a systematic survey, but I know it's very common among working class, low-income populations. So I get very worried that the distant education is going to stratify who gets the real education in my seminars at Washington and who gets the long distance. And I see a real class, racial stratification developing.
And related to that, I think, Jim, your comments about transformative citizenship education, it's very difficult to imagine that model occurring through the internet, especially when the kinds of communication that so often occur online are abbreviated and engagement escalates out of control so quickly. Yeah, I think both the stratification and the nature of learning both pose threats to that.
And that doesn't mean we shouldn't use distant education to supplement effective education.
Right.
But I am growing concerned that it's becoming it's stratified along racial and class lines.
You know, we forget that we have had a very good technology that can do almost anything that a MOOC can do for centuries, and that's called a book. and you know, all the arguments for distance learning, you know, the best teachers, you know, the latest information, et cetera, et cetera. And then you can go back and review it. You can replay the tape, you know. I mean, it's...
I want to say two things about this. One is just last night, I think, Stephen Colbert's program opened with a fake ad for the new Apple book. And it described in the kind of loving detail you see in an Apple ad how the pages have a very simple coding system. You have 61, followed by 62, followed by 63, and so on. And it was just really brilliant. But in a serious vein, you know, I think I feel very alive to the negative potentials that people are identifying here. And lots of, it's not irrational to have mistrust of how people will use these tools. At the same time, there are powerful possibilities that shouldn't be dismissed out of hand. You know, to take an example, MIT recently has proposed the question, not claiming to answer it, that for their students, it may be perfectly fine to have 3 years on campus and a first year online. And that you would get an MIT education, but you would create the possibility for people who can try this online at a relatively low cost, and some fraction of them who aren't found in the current smartness search will be found that way. So, and I don't, you know, I'm perfectly open to the idea that you know, at some point the University of Washington or a community college could consider, if it's done in a different spirit, and I understand the potential for exploitation here is huge, because you can just pretend you're educating people without educating them at all. I don't mean to dismiss that, but I also, you know, like many technologies, it has potentials in more than one direction.
Well, I would agree, and the University of Washington, I tell you, is really exploring this distant learning quite aggressively.
So I see a question in the back. Oh, Bob Floden, okay, we're,
Bob Floden from Michigan State University.
and then we'll come back to you after that.
I'm struck with Sandy's emphasis on learning, and one of the ways to think about learning is change in how much people know from one time to another. And in K-12, we learned through the last accountability regime that it's important not just to look at the outcomes of institutions in determining how well they're doing, but to look at how much they help people move from where they start to where they end. In higher education, it seems that we're focusing much more on the outcomes, and I'm wondering whether in higher education research there's a way to change the focus on the quality of the institutions from looking at the outcomes to looking at how much they add to students' knowledge over time.
Well, Corbin Campbell is one of the 2015 postdoc fellows, presented her research in the session with me this morning, and that's pretty much exactly what she does. So I definitely encourage the two of you to speak with each other. But yeah, the heart of this is that for a very long time, higher education has not paid attention to teaching and learning. We do not have an effective literature around pedagogy and curriculum the way that K-12 scholars do. There's a lot of catching up, and often there's borrowing from the K-12 world, even though the students, the contexts, the goals are very, very different. So yeah, it's really an open area.
And I would also note that the frequent co-contributor with Corbin is Anna Newman, who is with us this afternoon. And I think this may well be a growth area in higher education, and it sure as hell needs to be. Now, I want to come back to the person over here who had her hand up before, please.
Hi, I'm Kate Dessler from Western Washington University, a little bit north of the UW. So I teach at a comprehensive public university where there is and has been for quite a while more of a focus on teaching relative to what you see in a lot of research institutions. And I guess what I wanted to ask about was this question, though, of, and like many universities, it's thinking about how to handle a more diverse student body. And I wanted to ask about stratification within the university, and particularly the kind of potentially perverse incentives provided by emphasis on student success rate. And particularly one of the things we find is that students who come in who are less academically prepared, often low-income and minority students, get very early tracked out of more rigorous disciplines and into sometimes professional programs, sometimes other disciplinary programs that are seen as being less difficult. And I worry broadly about students not having a chance to fail and learn and kind of rebuild, but also the stark class and racial differences in terms of who's in the STEM courses, who's in the political science classes, and who's in those other sort of lower status fields. I think it's something we have to think about as we look at how to incentivize persistence, particularly.
Well, I think this comes back to our assessment methods. I think if we routinely assessed in a kind of value-added context, and I'm speaking very broadly here, and not just in terms of traditional 3 R's kind of assessment, but much more broadly to getting into some of the affective kind of qualities. But if we routinely did this with our students, and it can be very qualitative, like narrative evaluations, for example, are a very powerful alternative to grading. One of your neighbors, Evergreen, does a lot of that. That if that was just part of the information that we gathered about ourselves routinely, then we could begin to look at the relative effectiveness of alternative approaches, let's say to the less well-prepared student, or to the student who has some kind of learning difficulty. But without that basic information on what students are learning, we're tremendously handicapped in trying to improve our pedagogy.
I would add that the American Association of Colleges and Universities, AAC&U, has actually done quite a lot of work recently in these areas, some of it with Spencer's support.
Yeah, their LEAP program.
Right.
Yeah.
Question up here in the front. Sure, you do, and it's coming.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Gina Garcia. I'm at the University of Pittsburgh. I'm just wondering if y'all can speak a little bit about, we've spent a lot of time speaking about students, which obviously is important, but if y'all have any thoughts on like diversity among faculty, because that's obviously a pretty important part of the puzzle if we think about higher ed as like a system and how the system, all the parts affect each other. If y'all can talk a little bit about the lack of diversity and also the ways in which faculty are evaluated, particularly along like white normative standards and heteronormative standards and standards in which those of us who are minoritized maybe don't necessarily always fit within those models in the ways in which we're evaluated.
So Jim.
Yeah, I think that's a really important question of how do you increase the faculty and make it more diverse. And one of the things we found, for example, that if you increase the diversity of the faculty, the percentage of students from diverse group goes up. So there's a direct relationship. Also, we find that in terms of changing the climate, the cultural response of pedagogy, we find that the students of color tend to demand more of faculty of color. Geneva Gay and I, we have many students of color coming to us because they see us as more understanding and more empathetic and so forth. So I think it's very important to change not just to bring students of color, but that implies that we need to also make the curriculum more diverse and make the faculty more diverse. And I think that's extremely important to give students of color a sense of recognition, a sense of inclusion. But it's a continuing process. One of the things we found at universities like Washington or the University of Wisconsin, where Gloria Ladson-Billing teaches, and Carl Grant, is that when we're trying to recruit faculty of color, one of the things they're concerned about is there a culture within the university that will make it compatible and supportive and nurturing. Not, am I going to be the only one, or there will only be two of us. How do we then change the culture of the community? That becomes a very important factor in hiring faculty and maintaining and retaining faculty of color. Sometimes we hire them, but we don't keep them. So I think we have to think about maintaining as well as hiring and supporting. So I think it's extremely important. But it's a process that we at Washington have worked on for 40 years and still aren't where we are ought to be, but our College of Education has one of the most diverse faculties of education in the country. Our faculty of color at the University of Washington Faculty of Education is about 26%.
So I think we are going to have time for one more question. How about over here, gentleman over here? I presume you're a gentleman.
Yeah. Thanks. I appreciate the category. David
I
Pearson,
didn't
UC
realize it was
Berkeley.
you, David. I would have chosen other words.
David Pearson, UC Berkeley. I wanted to just raise three issues, and I know that there's no time for anybody to respond to them, so it's a good time to raise the issues. The first has to do with, I'd like to see us give a little more credence to virtual communities and the role that they play in developing a sense of belonging across geographic boundaries. And I think that particularly on the issue of global education, that there's a real role for virtual communities. I mean, I know a lot of us at our age don't like to belong to these Facebook communities and the like, but they're really very powerful. And I think that we need to acknowledge and study those as an addition to what it is that we can offer live on campuses. The second issue has to do with assessment, and I'm all for assessments other than standardized assessments and grades. But I would point out that the two experiments I know of where people have tried something different, narrative evaluations at UC Santa Cruz, amongst other institutions, as near as I can tell, is that system still there, or is it gone by the wayside? I know that one of the things that they had to do so that their graduates could get into graduate school is they had to have shadow grades so that they could tell people who were considering them for graduate school what grades they would have gotten if they'd actually given grades. And the other one was a movement about 10, 12 years ago, I think. I remember David Conley and Rich Shabelson were part of the movers and shakers on it, where they tried to develop a performance assessment that could be given across the years during university education. And I thought it was a really grand idea. But as near as I can tell, it never got any traction. And I don't know where it is today, but I can't remember the name of the assessment they developed. But they actually got into the development of some performance assessment items and the like to measure, if you will, growth in learning across time at the university level with something other than grades. But my problem is that those two experiments, both of which seemed pretty reasonable, seem not to have gained much momentum in higher ed.
Since I saw Sandy vigorously turning his head from side to side, I think we'll make time for him to have a response here.
Yeah, you've implied two different things here. One is that narrative evaluations didn't catch on. True. That they were a failure, you couldn't get into graduate school, that's a myth. It's been examined in great depth, and or you take a place like Hampshire College. Graduate schools seek out the Hampshire graduates. And, Bard College and Evergreen State and even Santa Cruz, which still has that option. But for some reason, the myth, and I think it had to do with the fact that we faculty didn't like all the work involved in that. So we wanted to hear, sort of like the political information we've been getting for the last year. We hear the things that we want to hear. But the investigations of narrative evaluations have shown that they don't handicap students, and in fact, there are certain advantages to have that kind of information on a student. Imagine if you had a choice between detailed narrative evaluations of an undergraduate and you're, let's say, an employer, and their GPAs. I mean, which would you prefer?
We are out of time. Remind you, as Jim said, that this is only the first of 3 plenaries, and I'm confident the others will rise to the very high standards set by our colleagues here today. So let's thank them for fascinating work.